What we need to do is take guns out of the hands of people who are dangerous people. It's a combination of a brittle person and the gun availability. You have to fix one or both of those in order to prevent gun violence.
I'm Sarah Ferris, true crime podcast producer.
And I'm Katherine Schweit, former head of the FBI's active shooter program.
And you're listening to Stop the Killing. Welcome to another episode of Stop the Killing. Merry Christmas for yesterday, if you celebrate Christmas. It is the 26th of December as this goes to air. We're obviously recording this well beforehand, aren't we, Katherine?
But this is everybody's Christmas present.
It is, because if you were listening to the last two episodes and not, maybe you were doing it when you were wrapping Christmas presents, I don't know. But the two episodes prior to this were both on the Lewiston, Maine shooting with Robert Conlon, who was the author of The Lewiston Shootings, an All-American Tragedy.
What I wanted to talk about today was just a little bit about the kinds of ways that we can prevent shootings and how that's being done effectively, even in places like Lewiston, Maine, where this terrible tragedy occurred back in October of 23. There was a 40-year-old gentleman who, if you listen to the podcast, you know he had a military background. He was an Army reservist here in the States. And there were a lot of concerns about him beforehand, which we talked about in the episode. And we'd love you to go back and find out about what those concerns were. But he, on that day in October, and he went into two different locations, a bowling alley and a restaurant. And in the process, he killed 18 people and he wounded another 13. It is and hopefully will always be the worst shooting tragedy that ever occurs in the state of Maine. So it's just a all-around tragedy.
And I think also for context, I remember when we were doing the interview with Robert Conlon from episode 6 and 7, 18 people were murdered on that night. And the year before the Lewiston, Maine incident, the entire year, 19 people, I think he mentioned. Double check that when you listen, listeners, but I'm pretty sure it was 19 for the entire year. So that's how significant it was. I mean, shocking anywhere, but just to give you some context, not something that they were used to.
I mean, I think what we hear here is no different than what you hear in the UK and in your home territory in New Zealand. Everybody says, well, that happens there, but it doesn't happen here.
Yeah.
When you go out to the scene of a crime, people always say, well, I know that happens, but I never thought it would happen here. Like if I had $1 for every time I heard that when I interviewed somebody, I would have some money. I would be buying us movie tickets. It is a common phrase, and no one thinks it happens in their neighborhood. And I think that there was no difference in Maine. It was pretty shocking in Maine.
And that probably puts into context why they maybe didn't have a red flag law that was quite as strong as some of the other states. So can you kind of lay the groundwork of what they did have in place in Lewiston that was different?
That's really what I want to talk about a little bit today, because, I think most of the people listening to this podcast who live in the United States, there's a pretty good chance they live in a state that has a red flag law. And a red flag law is actually a ERPO. You can see why nobody calls it that. They're some version of an extreme risk protection order, ERPO. And ERPO sounds weird, so we just call them red flag laws. And 20 states, I believe, right now have red flag laws, although it's changing over time. So red flag laws are, if you're not familiar with them, hopefully you never have to deal with them, but you should know that if there's a concern about somebody and you think that they're a threat, a danger to themselves or others, and they have access to firearms, in general, it's a law that allows law enforcement or the courts to intervene in some way to take the weapons out of the hands of that individual who's unstable at the moment for a period of time. It's an order that has to come from a court. And in a red flag law state, I could go to law enforcement and say, hey, I think my neighbor is really upset about his bankruptcy and his divorce. And I know he has a lot of firearms, and now he's talking about how he's no point to live anymore. And I'm really worried that he might commit suicide. And just for the record, none of my neighbors are in that state. But if
they're listening right now, we're not talking about you.
Right. We're not talking about you, Steve, Jean, Joe. No. So if I had that concern about a neighbor, I would go to law enforcement. And law enforcement in a red flag law state would go to the court and say, hey, we've had this person come in, they're concerned about this, and we'd like to get an order that would allow us to go collect the weapons from this person's house, but not just collect the weapons. We would like to go to court and have a judge decide whether their weapons should be retained for a while by somebody else, right? But not this individual. So that allows for an adjudication by a court, and then law enforcement can go to the house to say, hey, we're going to take the guns because we think that you're a risk to yourself or others, and we're going to hold on to them, or we need you to give them to somebody else for 3 months or 6 months or 2 weeks or whatever the court decided. The high end, I think, is like 6 months, right, before the court order passes. And that's just kind of a general summary of how red flag laws work. And they vary in details from state to state.
How well known are red flag laws to people on the ground? Like, do people on the street look at their neighbors and think, oh,
no,
do they not? Yeah. So,
no,
I mean,
that is so good that you bring that up because
yeah.
No, that's a great point. That's a great point, Sarah, is that I would wager that, literally, I would take this bet in Vegas that if I touched base with every neighbor on my street, 30 households, say, I would wager that maybe one or two even know that those types of laws exist, which kind of is a problem, right?
Well, it is, because I think a lot of the apathy that happens when information comes to people, and we're talking, like your neighbors or somebody in school, you often feel kind of a little bit powerless if you give that information to someone, but just knowing that actually it might trip a sequence of events that will lead to those guns being taken away is quite powerful to know.
Yeah, and I think that there's, as not surprisingly, there's two, kind of huge sides to it. There's
I was going to say,
of course, there is this, everything has to do with firearms in the States.
Yeah.
There's a whole bucket load of people who are looking for ways to save lives and see this as a small area where you might be able to save lives. Anybody who listens to this podcast has heard me say before, what we need to do is take guns out of the hands of people who are dangerous people, right? It's a combination of a brittle person and the gun availability. So you have to fix one or both of those in order to prevent firearms and gun violence. But I think most people don't know that they exist because, there's also kind of a much smaller but a much more vocal subset of people who will always say, don't touch my guns. Don't touch my guns. I know better. Don't touch my guns.
Presumably that's why there's 20 states that have it instead of all of them.
Yeah. Certainly there are some states that are not going to pass anything that has to do with guns,
right?
The gun laws in any way. But the idea of extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws and states passing them, in part, is kind of in the newer realm of things, right? For 40 years, it seems like we think about that or pass any laws. So it's not so much that a lot of states reject them as much as it is that the legislatures have just kind of gotten around to passing them, as we have had very sad events occur, particularly Sandy Hook, I think, is a great example of an event that shocked the conscience of the country. Clearly didn't shock it enough to make the substantive changes that some people would like to see changed. So states are doing it on their own.
If I was to ask you this question without giving you any pre-research time at all and put you on the spot, just
wow, I'd be shocked.
Diving into the depths of the knowledge of Katherine Schweit, when you look at the cases that we've covered or mass shootings that you've studied, is there ones back in time before red flag laws came into effect that the red flag law could have taken those weapons out of this person's hand from the information that had been given?
Well, I think there's two parts to that answer. I think the first part is absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the genesis really of the Stop the Killing podcast. There are plenty of instances where there were lots of signs of individuals, and those signs didn't lead to the prevention of a shooting, even though, one or more people saw those signs. And that's really what a red flag law is. It's the idea of we're going to see something and say something, right? There's been a lot of see something, but my beef is we often see something, but we often don't say something.
So true. And I also feel like for people, you've got to trust that somebody will also do something.
And that's fair too, because if that somebody is police, a lot of times individuals say, well, I called the police, they didn't do anything about it.
Exactly.
My neighbor's crazy and they didn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's an understanding that law enforcement only has so many tools in their toolkit. Right. Red flag laws are a tool that they have. I was just in another state talking to a bunch of corporate people, saying to them, if you don't make a call to the police don't have a reason to knock on somebody's door. They can't. That's part of it. If you think that there's a person at risk and you call the police and say, I don't know if this is a problem, but it seems like a problem, and can you look into it? Then law enforcement has the ability, has that base information to go and knock on the door and say, hey, Jane or John, we got a call. We're concerned about this. If law enforcement doesn't know that, if they never get a call, they would never stop by Jane or John's house.
So what I'm hearing is that the red flag laws are something that you would want in your state. You should probably know whether or not that's something that's in your state. Am I wrong in saying that?
No, I think that's great. I think that is great. It's another tool, and we don't really give ourselves a chance to use it, right? Here, I've got a note that says, there's 21 states and the District of Columbia. Somebody just passed one for these extreme risk, or these gun violence restraining orders, or extreme risk protection orders. The first state was in California in 2016. So that shows you how new it is. And the red flag law is a great example of something that civilians really probably don't know enough about. We should be yelling more about that and saying, hey, this is out there. But, I think there's people walk on pins and needles to talk about red flag laws, because many times they say, well, you're just trying to take our guns away.
So if you weren't living in a red flag state yourself, what would Katherine Schweit be doing about that? Do you believe in the red flag laws being powerful?
Oh, yeah, I do, because I think that the data shows us that, if they've started to do research on red flag laws, which are relatively new, as I mentioned, like the first one, California, 2016. So, when it comes to a study and data and stuff like that, we don't have a ton of great data on it. But the work that has been done in different states. And so a state will say, oh, we passed this law on this year, and we have the use of the red flag law this many times, and this is what it prevented, or this is what we think it prevented. And I think those are powerful. Here, I'll give you some examples. In 2016 study published in the Journal of, yes, I'm reading, in the Journal of Contemporary Problems, analyzed data from 762 gun removals under Connecticut's law, right? So over 4 years, they removed 762 guns and determined that there was one averted suicide for every 10 to 11 gun seizures.
Wow.
One averted suicide, right?
Wow. That's a lot of lives saved.
Remember initial FBI research that I wrote? Yeah. 10% of our shooters killed a family member first. Yeah. 10% killed a spouse or partner domestically. And 30 to 40% every year in active shooter situations do intend to and do commit suicide. So the researchers said, enacting and implementing laws like Connecticut's civil risk warrant statute. This is a civil process as opposed to a criminal process, right? That's a big difference.
But the police involved in a civil...
Police are involved in civil actions,
but it doesn't go through the law courts. It goes through the civil courts.
Yes, right, exactly. There can be a crossover in the given moment. And a lot of times a red flag law, the concept is we're trying to prevent a criminal action. So we're going to do this civil action in courts. It's not a criminal charge against you. It's like a divorce proceeding, right? And that's not a criminal action.
That makes sense.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's something that people maybe don't think of too. You think, oh, law enforcement, and you're getting somebody in trouble. You're not
Yeah.
getting somebody in trouble. And let me give you one other example too, because I remember reading this study that said the state of Indiana was an early adopter of red flag laws. And I remember the research showing that once it was enacted, researchers identified 7 or 8% reduction in suicides in that state that they attributed directly to the red flag laws.
Lives saved.
Lives saved, lots of lives saved. Exactly. So, I mean, I think that's pretty significant. The reason that we're talking about red flag laws when I started out saying, oh, I'm going to talk about yellow flag laws is to understand that nearly half our states in the District of Columbia have red flag laws, but the state of Maine has something that is a little bit more challenging because it's called a yellow flag law. In a red flag law situation, different states say who goes to the police, who can go to the courts. So some states may say that a family member has to be the person who law enforcement relies on, or somebody who lives with that person has to be who the law enforcement officer relies on to go to the court, and they have to come to the judge. And the spouse has to say, I'm concerned about this. But some other states, it's more expansive. Like a neighbor might call a friend and might call a coworker, and the state might allow for the law enforcement to bring forth to the judge for adjudication, a number of different people in positions that they hold, anybody with knowledge and information about that individual. So the state laws vary a little bit about who can bring the information. And then what they're bringing is generally just any information that indicates that an individual is a risk to themselves or others. That's red flag laws. Yellow flag laws are the same in terms of we're going to potentially take a firearm or firearms away from your access if we believe you're a danger to yourself or others. However, under a yellow flag law, the state law requires that the law enforcement actually bring the person to the court and make the adjudication in the court. See any problems or risks with that?
Well, you've got to get hold of the person, right?
There is that. Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, from memory, the Lewiston shooting, the police came and knocked on his door but couldn't access the property because nobody answered the door and therefore walked away from the situation. Would there be something that they could have done more if they had red flag laws and the person didn't answer the door?
Yes. I mean, in some ways. So let's go back and look at the situation in Maine. And what did we know at the time? Just briefly, he had been in the Army Reserves. And so he was in his training and he was behaving erratically, I think is the easiest summary. In different instances, he was saying things and doing things. And I think probably the most extreme thing is that an individual who he was in the reserves with, who was in a car with him, he indicated, right? I mean, you're shaking your head if you have better words than I do. He indicated that he wanted to commit a violent act. And that was reported to his superiors, who reported that to the police, who tried to find him so they could follow up on this statement that he perhaps was going to commit a violent act. In that case, what we heard afterwards was, why didn't law enforcement do anything? Law enforcement dropped the ball. Why didn't law enforcement do anything? Well, I mean, they did, according to law enforcement, get the information, and they did try to find him once or twice. This is an individual who lived in the woods. He was skilled with a weapon. He was a hunter, like many people who live in Maine. So the use of firearms wasn't unusual. Having firearms wasn't unusual. But there were family members who were also concerned that he was a little bit going off the grid. The law enforcement had spoken to the family members and they'd said, yeah, we're going to try to take the guns away from him. So I think there was a recognition by those around him. And that's where kind of the fail was, is like, as a society as a whole, we kind of failed everybody in the circumstance because, we knew there was somebody who was troubled. But in this case, the state had a yellow flag law, so they couldn't go to court ahead of time and get an order to take the guns away. And they never found him in the house, right? In the couple of times they went to the house, they didn't find him in the house. So your question, long before I started babbling, was, could a red flag law have made a difference? Even I think it could have. The law enforcement could have taken the family members and the information that they had from the military service, gone to court and gotten an order to temporarily collect the weapons that he had access to. Absolutely, they could have gotten an order to do that if there's a red flag law. So that's like my first answer.
Okay. Practically wise, in terms of practicality of enacting that. So they've turned up, they've knocked on the door, nobody's answered, but they've got the red flag law in that state. They can then go into the property and remove the guns, or no?
Well,
No.
it's not quite that simple. You have to get a search warrant, right? So
Right.
you can access the house when somebody's not there if you have a search warrant. And there's all the rules in the search warrant that people don't know and you never see on television is you can access a location if you have a search warrant to access it. If you access it by breaking a lock on a door, then when you leave, you have to replace the door and secure the facility. So in practicality, even if they had a search warrant for the guy's house, here's what I would say as straight up law enforcement. If we sit on this guy's house, meaning like if we do surveillance and we stay at the edge of his property and we believe he's not in the house, then there's no threat involving the weapons in the house. So why would we break into the house and get them? To get weapons that he's not in there to use. So I think in theory, it seems like a great idea, but in practicality, if he's in his house, we're going to catch him before he leaves.
Yeah.
If he's not in his house, he's not using the weapons that might be in there. So we don't need to separate him from his weapons. He's not there. So when law enforcement knocks on the door, as they said they did, and said, hey, we couldn't find him, apparently he wasn't there. Now, maybe he wasn't answering, right? But also, people who live out in the middle of the woods, they have vehicles. You can see if somebody's there. If there's no vehicle there, I believe there was an officer who went twice and didn't find somebody there. So it's not as easy, maybe, as it is, in the movies. That's what I'm going to say.
Okay, but let me put this to you then. So how would the red flag law have been enacted differently in this case then?
I think part of it is that it's the opportunity for law enforcement to be confident that they have the courts okay to confiscate somebody's guns. The court is saying this is not an unreasonable search and seizure. It is not a violation of somebody's Fourth Amendment rights. So it's a step in furtherance where an independent party, a judge, has looked at the facts and circumstances and said, we think there is a reasonable cause for action here by law enforcement. There's probable cause to believe that he might be a danger to himself or others. And so I think that's part of the difference is if you had a warrant in hand, you would seek aggressively to execute it. If they had seen him someplace else, even not in his own property, if they had seen him at the local restaurant, they could have stopped him at the local restaurant and said, we have a warrant to collect your guns. So we'd like to go to your house with you and do that. And it's a lawful order so that he couldn't prevent it.
So compared to what did happen, which was almost like a wellness check.
Exactly. If you have a court order, like from a red flag law, you can tell your entire department, right? You can tell the county, you can tell the state police, hey, this is the guy. Here's his license plate. Here's what he looks like. We're looking to execute this duly, lawfully issued warrant to confiscate his guns for a time period of 4 months or 2 months or 6 months, and then bring to court, right? There's another step to red flags that generally are like, and we're going to come to court, and then you have a right to come to court and say, I'm perfectly fine, and these guns were taken improperly. So there's a follow-up court action. So all of law enforcement could have been more in a position to look for this individual, and so it would have given law enforcement a lot more power.
Yeah, that's what I'm
hearing. But they don't have that. What they have is a yellow flag law. Let me tell you a little bit about what's happened in Maine with regard to the yellow flag laws since the Lewiston shooting. I went back to look at this because I wanted to know, what effect has it had? Because as I mentioned, we know that it has a big impact for suicide prevention, and other types of threats. But I really didn't, I'm like, okay, well, what has really happened in Maine? Because it's kind of a microcosm. After the Lewiston incident, they did make some changes in the yellow flag laws to kind of streamline the process a little bit more in Maine. But I wanted to know, well, what happened before? And because like you were saying, well, do people even know red flag laws exist in their state? Chances are no, but they should, and we should be touting that, I guess, more often. In Maine, this brought to light the value of a yellow flag law. And so I went back to look to see, hey, how much and what? So here's what I found. Here's a little bit of what I found. Stand by for news. I found the yellow flag law was passed in 2020, but I don't know exactly what month. And then the shooting was in October, so almost 4 years. In the first 4 years that the statute was in existence in Maine, yellow flag laws were used 81 times. And then the shooting happened. And then from the shooting, within the next year, yellow flag laws were used 412 times.
Wow. Man. I mean, I know we say
That's-
this is not a maths podcast, but there's some pretty phenomenal numbers in there. That is incredible. Why do you think that is?
Yeah.
Because is there a change in who's reporting it? Or is there a change in
I
how
think
seriously it's taken? What do you think it is?
I think it's the latter, based on zero evidence. I mean, I think that it's people knew about it now. They're like, hey,
Mm,
and they were afraid because you
Yeah.
know everybody says this doesn't happen in my neighborhood. This doesn't not in my backyard. That happens someplace else. It happened there.
yeah.
It happened there. But it's that frustration of like, oh, we can't do anything about it. But I think the people in Maine, collectively realized, oh, well, here's one thing we can do. We are not
Mhm.
law enforcement. We're not the military. We're not the federal government. But what we can do is I can prevent this from happening to my loved one. Because what happened to the subject in the Lewiston, Maine shooting? He killed himself.
Yeah.
Right. So I can prevent this from happening in my house, or I can prevent this from happening in my daughter's house where her husband is under this kind of stress. So some of the examples of what occurred.
Oh,
That
that
was
was
the
going to
other
be my
thing.
next
Yeah.
question.
Right. Yep. They have an adult behavioral health non-for-profit that mans a 24-hour telehealth screening as part of the yellow flag law process. And which I love because
Yeah.
what it's telling us is that people are calling someplace, not just calling their local police department, but they're calling telehealth saying, hey, we're just really concerned about this. So
Brilliant.
when we were talking math, I just want you to know, I don't do the math, but the math that I saw when I saw those numbers said that before the Lewiston, Maine shooting, yellow flag laws were used 5 times a month. 5 times a month. And now they're used an average of 34 times a month.
Wow.
So let me just back it up to just say one suicide is prevented for every 17 to 23 red flag law uses, according to this American Academy of Psychiatry and Law. Suicide is so relevant to these kinds of calls. And so when you look at what happened in Maine, the Attorney General's office found that, well, let me just give you some examples, because I think it's easier for people to apply.
Definitely.
And so here's what the Maine Attorney General summarized some. Just about a year after the shooting in Maine, local police used a yellow flag law when a 50-year-old man who was struggling with his girlfriend to retrieve a handgun to shoot himself. His 14-year-old son restrained him until police arrived. They used the yellow flag law to take the gun away.
Wow. What's quite powerful about that statement is like this happened, October to October. As we're recording this, it's November. So it's only been just over a year since this has, and there's been 412 times that yellow flag laws have been enacted. And then you think of today, if you're listening to this as it's come out, it's the day after Christmas. And how many people are sitting around the Christmas table or are not lost and not dead because the yellow flag laws, like that 50-year-old man, stopped suicides? It's quite powerful.
I will say, too, that it is not lost on anybody listening that the holidays are very tough times for people.
Yeah. So true.
People,
it's massive stressor.
It's very stressful. I mean, I lost my mom a few years ago. It's very stressful. And people who maybe have lost a child or their circumstances have changed, or they're home by themselves, it's difficult for them. They're away from loved ones and things like that. Holidays are very stressful. And knowing that there are resources that are out there that you can tap to there are so many resources, so many hotlines, right? And
So many.
knowing that those people are, like you said, around the table today because somebody had the ability to help them and reach out is fantastic. I'm going to just point out here in the States, we just adopted a national suicide hotline phone number. And, if you have an emergency, you call 911. If we have a national suicide hotline number, 988. 988.
Wow, PSA.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because a lot of people still don't know that. It's kind of new. I think in the States right now, it's just available mostly in English and Spanish, but 988, and they'll find somebody who speaks your language if you need it, But with that in mind, that wasn't just those kinds of situations. Let me give you a couple of other examples that occurred this year. A county sheriff reported that a 36-year-old man badly assaulted two coworkers, and they say unprovoked while he was in a manic state. He believed that his dead mother was guiding him and that he's a prophet, and part of the beating was part of that.
Wow.
The same week, another county sheriff's office reported a 25-year-old man who texted photos to his girlfriend of himself holding a pistol to his head, said he was going to kill himself.
And they enacted the yellow flag law and took those weapons away. And those people are still are still alive because of it.
Exactly. Right.
Wow.
Right. So overall, we're beginning to see the numbers, right? Piece by piece, the numbers are coming in because red flag laws and yellow flag laws are relatively new, from a research standpoint. But the numbers overwhelmingly show in 90% of the yellow flag law cases, people are expressing homicidal or suicidal indications. 90%. 52% of them indicated threats of suicide.
Gosh.
So 52%. And so what the law enforcement is saying is, look, there's been a steady increase in it, and in part due to judges, officers, and hospitals getting familiar with and how to use the laws, right? How to use the laws. And so I think that makes a huge difference. I mean, it is complicated, right? You have to take somebody, get them into your car, take that person to a mental health facility, to a hospital, get somebody there to say, yeah, this is a person that is a danger to themselves or others. Take that information to a court.
Yeah.
And when I said they kind of streamline things, it used to be that had to be done within a very short period of time, and now they've allowed it to be a little bit longer. And one of the very practical impacts about that is that it takes time to find a judge, to get a judge into court. If the law said 48 hours, and I don't know, I can look and see what it was, but if the law said 48 hours and this is something that happened on a Friday at 10 o'clock at night,
you're stuffed.
You have to find a judge sometime on the weekend in that 48 hours in that county who can, and you have to get them to a hospital, and you have to get somebody to give that kind of a psychiatric or mental health evaluation to that. It's hard to do that within a certain amount of time, and you're asking law enforcement to do a very complicated job.
Yeah.
Right.
But by the sounds of it, like, law enforcement has stepped up. If they were enacting it 81 times previously, and we're at 412, something's changed. Somebody's taking notice.
Okay. And while you were saying that, yes, I completely agree. I looked down at my notes, and the change was not 48 hours. The law in the yellow flag law in Maine was 14 days. They had 14 days to get this person to a judge after all this other stuff. Now they have 30. It just gives them that extra window to say, look, we're going to keep you in protective custody because we think that you're going to try to kill yourself for others, and you will get your time in court. So the reason I really wanted to talk about this today is I just think it's a really great opportunity to bring to light the value of red flag laws, which there are many. The data on red flag laws, there's more to it, but even this yellow flag, it's more complicated. But if it works for Maine right now and it saves lives, and it saved potentially 400 or more lives in Maine, right, over the last year.
Yeah, that's a lot.
They all ate Christmas dinner. They're all going to celebrate New Year's. That's a good thing.
Thank you for joining us on Stop the Killing. Remember, these conversations aren't just important, they're necessary. If you're ready to dive deeper into the issues we cover, Katherine's book, Stop the Killing, and also How to Talk About Guns with Anyone are available now at katherineschweit.com. Stop the Killing is proudly produced by Sarah Ferris Media. For more award-winning podcasts like Conning the Con and Watching Two Detectives, visit sarahferrismedia.com. As an independent podcast, we rely on your support to keep these critical discussions alive. If you value our work, please consider supporting us on patreon.com/stopthekilling or by simply subscribing on Apple Podcasts now. Not only will you help us to continue this mission, but you'll also get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive content that takes a deeper look into unfolding incidents. And don't forget, Stop the Killing is a team effort. You can make a difference by leaving a review on Apple and sharing this podcast with others. Together, we can keep pushing these conversations forward. Thank you for being part of this journey. Stay safe, stay informed, and let's continue to stop the killing.